Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today, I have Marco and Richard and Chris, returning guest, back with us today. And we're discussing the results of the South African elections, which the results have been trickling in over the last few days. And we have a bit of a picture, I think, of what the outcome is going to be. And we're going to discuss that just a little bit. So, for anyone who hasn't been following, these are often being described as probably the most significant elections since the 90s and the end of apartheid. The ANC, which has been in power for about 30 years now, is thought to perhaps they're going to lose their majority, which is quite a big thing. And they're possibly going to have to form a coalition, all this kind of stuff. We're going to get into those and discuss those just a little bit. So, Chris, why don't you just give people some details, tell them how it's been going and what you think about it?
Thanks very much, and thank you for having me back. Always good to get to chat with you guys. So, for Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of the ANC and the president of the country, in the 1990s, he was one of the key figures negotiating on the new constitution with various parties and interest groups. Now it looks like he's going to be the first ANC president to have to lead the party into a performance below 50% for the first time in a national and provincial election cycle. So at the moment, with just around 75% of the votes counted, we're looking at the ANC coming in around 40% nationally. That's from a high point in 2004 of 69%, and in 2019 when they obtained 57%. So a massive decline for the ANC across the board. They're still the biggest political party in South Africa, but I think given everything, the lead up to the elections, really pushing hard on the international stage, taking Israel to the International Court of Justice to try and shore up some support, signing a radical healthcare policy act in the form of the National Health Insurance, which effectively nationalizes private healthcare in the hands of the state, couching their opponents as wanting to take away people's social grants and social welfare. So really leaning into, I guess, all the notes that you can from a sort of left populist point of view, and still coming in around 40%, I think is quite significant. So for the ANC, a lot of introspection, a lot of questions. It's not clear yet whether Ramaphosa will stay on or not. It has been communicated from within the sort of leadership of the ANC that they still want him to remain as leader. But I guess it's like if you're a football manager, if your owner says you're fine, you're safe, your job is secure, maybe then you should start to get really worried. The biggest takeaway story, apart from the ANC's performance, is that of the MK party, or Umkhonto weSizwe, the face of which is former President Jacob Zuma, so supported very strongly in Zulu-speaking areas like the KwaZulu-Natal province. In that particular province at the moment, MK coming in at 44%. In our own polling, we had around four parties, around 20% each. So for MK to come in at 44%, I think is quite incredible. And the support is not only restricted to KZN and Zulu-speaking areas, but parts of Mpumalanga, the southern parts of that particular province, also in Gauteng, the economic hub of South Africa, where Pretoria and Johannesburg are located. So MK making serious inroads and looking at the moment to become the third biggest political party in South Africa, displacing the more left-leaning Marxist economic freedom fighters. The last point that I'll make, just in terms of sort of overview, for the economic freedom fighters, an offshoot of the ANC, led by the former leader of the ANC Youth League, Julius Malema. Here we see this clear dichotomy between the rhetoric of radical leftism, wanting to nationalize the Reserve Bank, nationalize private banks, wanting to expropriate property, the rhetoric of the EFF, versus maybe what your average South African, who tends to be a bit more centrist, if not right-leaning, sort of conservative, small c conservative in many social respects. That disconnect with the EFF, they were the third biggest party, had been growing in every election they've contested, now possibly only the fourth biggest party in South Africa. So I think also for them, serious introspection. The Democratic Alliance, the official opposition, they at the moment look likely to be the only established party to actually grow in this election, even if it is only by 1 to 2%.
Sure. And just before I go to you, Mark and Richard, so you were discussing some of the parties there, and I think there's something like 70 political parties in this election, right? So there's a huge spread. So there's the ANC, who are the government in power. There's the economic freedom fighters, who you said, who are kind of a radical left, kind of Marxist-Leninist perspective. The MK are being led by, is it Jacob Zuma, the former president? And they're named after, is it the former militant wing of the ANC, right? So
Right, exactly.
also quite radical. And then the Democratic Alliance, you said kind of conservative, I think economically kind of liberal, more leaning towards
Yeah.
free markets. Right.
Yeah, more
So that,
classically liberal, sort of non-racialism. Yeah, more in that direction. And they in 2019 they suffered one of their worst results. So they had also an internal crisis at that point. Questions around: do you lean more into quote unquote representation and transformation, or where should you do your messaging kind of thing? I think in a country as diverse as South Africa in terms of cultures, languages, for the DA to come in at the moment between 22 and 25% as the second biggest political party, I think is a testament to the work that they've done.
Mark and Richard?
Yeah, as Chris pointed out, it's quite a momentous event. We've seen the ANC, which is in power since the Nelson Mandela Day in 2004. And this kind of loss of votes is just more than apathy. I mean, we probably should point out that at this point, the results are about 75% and about 58% turnout. So lots of people chose not to turn up. Would be interested to hear from Chris what he thinks the reasons are. But also I think for the first time, in individual, what are they called? People with no affiliation to party were allowed to be elected, to be in the selection, and the voting, the ballot itself included 52 slots. If you saw them, it's quite hilarious how many choices you have in a single ballot, which is fairly unusual as well. And probably this fragmentation has helped chipping away some of the votes that the ANC used to get. But again, because of Zuma creating his new party, this party was never tested at the election before, which at the moment, again, with 75% of the result, it's polling about 13%. This will, if you put ANC and the old Zuma party together, it still would be a 55% total. So I wonder, is the ANC actually losing votes through this new Zuma party, or is something bigger? And also, again, quite significant is the performance of the Democratic Alliance, which is beginning to be seen as a party where every South African can vote to. It used to be mainly seen as the white vote, the old pre-Mandela vote. But nowadays, it's a bit like the Republican Party. Black people feel, okay, we like this kind of stuff. We're going to vote for them. And this is causing a bit of a kickback from the rest of the population. And the same as the Republican Party in the United States, I suppose, when Black people are accused of being, I don't know, voting for the enemy, effectively. And so you still have this kind of sectarian stuff that is still quite prevalent in South Africa. But, you know, as far as we can tell, if the ANC loses votes, it can only be a good thing for the South Africans.
I don't know whether you wanted to respond to what Mark has said before I launch into a bunch of my questions for you as well, Chris, just to...
Sure, I can touch on some of that. Just to highlight one province, Gauteng, again, where Johannesburg, Pretoria are located, so your economic heartland, could very much be a sort of bellwether for the future of the country, what the national parliament might look like. So at the moment, the ANC on 35%, the DA at 27.5%. So you could see a lot more competition provincially, but also nationally, especially in your more urbanized areas where your voters, your citizens have relatively high levels of education, your more aspirant sort of middle class. I mentioned the national health insurance. For the ANC, timing that almost 2 weeks before the elections, the signing of that particular bill, where there was lots of criticism from across the board, where, you know, people, they give up the moral high ground. They say, of course, we're in favor of universal healthcare, etc. We're just worried about this particular way of implementing it. But regardless of your sort of ideological take on that sort of system of healthcare provision, lots of concerns from healthcare professionals, everyone. So criticisms of the process, the engagement, the feedback, etc., etc. The ANC just sort of steamrolled all of that. It seems like for that aspirant middle class, and the majority of whom are Black South Africans, who want things like quality private healthcare for themselves, for their children, for their families, the ANC pushing something like the NHI pushed that aspirant middle class in your more urban areas like Gauteng, maybe in parts of KwaZulu-Natal as well, away from the ANC. So I think it's interesting to watch Gauteng going forward. I mean, there won't be one party with a majority above 50%. So what's the coalition going to look like? For me, as someone who lives in Johannesburg, the local metro and the council has had various iterations the last few years. We've had a record number of mayors. I think there should be a competition between the number of prime ministers in the UK versus the number of mayors in Johannesburg in a given period of time, and track that on a poll, on a graph. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that specific province, where whether the parties can work together or not to establish maybe service delivery focused agreements, how they can work to get things to run properly, will be an interesting question.
Sure. So some points I wanted to raise. It included, firstly, the number of parties or individuals on the ballot. Always strikes me as when you get to that number, it demonstrates a country that's already got some problems, because it's often about pull peddling, and you want to be on the list simply to increase your pull, either when it comes to trading off in coalitions or just to raise your profile when it comes to other local business deals or whatever. I think in terms of the top few parties, they seem to be very associated with the faces of their leaders. The DA aside, possibly, but the other top three runners here, they're very associated with their main leaders. When it comes to the EFF, I noticed that we're talking about them coming, reducing in popularity lately. Of course, they're the ones who've taken the most hardline stance when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, hasn't it? They've wanted to arm Hamas even as one of their proposed policies. So it's good from our perspective to see that in decline. But I wonder if overall much of this is really just reflects the segregation of Zuma off from the ANC, and a lot of the reduction in ANC's performance is simply related to that and the court case and him not being able to run, and all of that taken together. What do you think to some of those points?
Yeah, I think Zuma, he continues to shape South African politics, and the more court cases he has, the more it's media opportunities for him. The more he and his supporters can frame it as persecution, victimhood. In the province where he is most popular, in KwaZulu-Natal, in July of 2021, there was sustained riots and lots of damage to public and private property as a consequence of his, I mean, it wasn't ever proven or linked directly, but as a consequence of his jailing at the time. He was released maybe between 2 and 4 hours after that. And then also at the same time, the president of the country, Ramaphosa, pardoned a whole number of prisoners, of whom he happened to be one. So the ANC, Ramaphosa, throughout his presidency, as leader of the ANC and of the country, his leadership style is sort of social compacting, negotiation, putting party unity above maybe the broader interests of South Africa, as it were, and not wanting to take action on people like Zuma, always wanting to apologize and pardon him, and making sure that MK, that the party is allowed to run and contest the elections. It's interesting how that's coming back to maybe really bite the ANC at this point in time. So they're not a particularly decisive leader, and now having to deal with that particular situation. Just on the court case at the ICJ that South Africa has pushed so strongly, maybe wanting to shore up its support locally in the Western Cape, where the Democratic Alliance governs and has governed for the last few years. They seem secure at around 53%, so they've done well to secure their home province, as it were. The ANC is down to 20% from around 30% in 2019, and a newer player, the Patriotic Alliance, which plays more towards sort of coloured South Africans, their interests and their concerns. That party is now the third biggest at 8.2%. So to me, and the Patriotic Alliance is very strongly pro-Israel. So for all the ANC did to, quote unquote, be for Palestine, for human rights in Gaza, and wanting to use that vote in the Western Cape amongst Muslim South Africans, or they perceived, of course, that Muslim South Africans all think the same and will vote the same kind of thing. That didn't seem to translate into actual vote share for them. The Patriotic Alliance, a strongly pro-Israel party, as I mentioned, took a lot of the ANC's vote share, almost 10%.
It's worth pointing out that coloured in this context means mixed race, essentially, doesn't it? In the South African context.
So the other thing I wanted to ask about is what you view, I guess we've been touching around this, but what you view as the kind of major thing that's driving voters in this election, because the sensitive issue is whether racial tribalism is still playing a large role in South African politics, or is the ANC losing out because of dissatisfaction around unemployment, which is sort of shockingly high. I think it's hovering in the 30s, even higher for 18 to 24-year-olds, something like 40%. Is there dissatisfaction with the ANC's record on state capture? Is it these kind of more pertinent issues, or is race still playing a large role in South African politics?
I think there could be 2 to 3 issues. I don't think it's race. I think it could be more cultural and linguistic. That being said, for the MK party, of course, their biggest impact has been in Zulu-speaking areas. But even in areas around the country that don't have Zulu speakers, there has been some element of impact. And that to me is more linked to sort of the figure that is Jacob Zuma, the sort of celebrity status, the cultural impact, all that kind of thing, which doesn't necessarily just mean, I'm not trying to say that, race and language might not, that sort of tribalism play some sort of role. But I think it is becoming a bit wider cut than that. I think your bread and butter issues, your service delivery issues like water provision, electricity, in the last month, the electricity supply has been better than it's been. So it's interesting also the timing around that in the lead up to the elections, how, okay, now the lights are on and things are fixed again. Everyone in the days leading up to the election, they were sort of sharing memes around social media saying, have you got your schedule locked in for power cuts on the 31st of May? That fortunately hasn't happened just yet. But some of those issues had been somewhat resolved. So it shows you the ANC realized that was going to hurt them a lot. But yeah, I don't know if this is almost too Marxist an interpretation, but your rural and urban split, especially in a more rural province like KwaZulu-Natal, where for many people with the high unemployment, lower levels of economic development, maybe feeling left behind in a way by your sort of more urban elites, by your political elites, by people running the ANC, feeling that there's no real focus on them and their concerns. So why not go for someone who might well be worse in many ways? I mean, at the heart of state capture and things like that is Jacob Zuma. But at least he's that sort of idea of what you see is what you get. He's authentic. He's one of us. He lives here. He might live in a mansion, but at least he still lives in his home province. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory sort of answer, but I think it is becoming. You're seeing more and more the sort of urban-rural split, politics of resentment, victimhood, feeling left behind, and whether individuals in politics can exploit that. That being said, you still have voter turnout, as you rightly highlighted, between 55 and 58%. That's on a downward trend since at least 2004. So even there, you've got lots of individuals in the country who are starting to feel that not even voting will change their lot in life. So what routes do they pursue? Do they engage in protest action, other ways of undermining sort of democracy and the rule of law? And in that sort of environment where there's less political engagement, maybe more uncertainty and chaos, I think your more maligned foreign actors do benefit from that. And there again is some of the element of who exactly was funding Zuma and the MK party, who from a foreign point of view, because that campaign was very impressive, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. They took already councillors, wards away from the ANC in the lead up to the elections. You don't do that sort of thing without substantive resources. So I think that question will continue to hang over them.
And just for viewers who aren't too familiar with South African politics, so state capture, if I'm getting this right, is referring to basically huge kind of corruption that existed under Zuma's government, siphoning off of state money, that kind of thing. Could you just explain that as a bit of context?
Yeah. So this goes sort of into the ANC's history and its roots. When in exile, a lot of the leadership trained in the Soviet Union, just not only in terms of material, obviously, but in terms of intellectual training and capacity. So the ANC is guided by the National Democratic Revolution, where the ANC is the sort of vanguard of the People's Workers' Revolution. It needs to be in charge of the economy, of society, of the government, needs to run state departments, your state-owned enterprises, like the one that provides electricity. So we have one state-run company, Eskom, that is responsible for electricity provision. In logistics, we have Transnet. They run the ports and the railways. So the party puts itself at the center. Part of that is you need to deploy your cadres, your political appointees to state departments, throughout the private sector where you can, obviously not in very direct ways. You can't make capital flee too quickly. You need to do it in a progressive, long-term kind of way. But you try and place people in these ways. And then for Zuma and those close to him, they exploited those networks. I would say it's a feature of that sort of ideology. It's not an aberration or a bug. But if you've got your political party enmeshed with the government, enmeshed with lots of government departments, state-owned companies, and private sector businesses, I think you always create the incentives for corruption and waste to occur in that way. So that manifested then in the relationship between Zuma and the Gupta family, where they could appoint people to various positions. We famously had a finance minister for one weekend, the weekend special, that obviously did lots of damage to the rand when he was sort of parachuted in, and then the markets reacted and Zuma had to recall him. But it's that sort of meshing of the relationship between party and state and the corruption that I think will always ensue in that sort of situation. And just sorry, before we get to our next talking point, there's been, since Ramaphosa has taken over, he campaigned on this idea of the new dawn, and there was quote unquote euphoria or Ramaphoria for President Ramaphosa. He was going to renew the ANC. It was at the end of state capture. But none of the policies have shifted. You've had the pushing of the national health insurance, still threats to property rights, continued cadre deployment, lots of strong patronage, networks being built. So none of that has changed. So yeah, I think the current sort of economic malaise of the country is a consequence of those policies, and you're seeing the ANC being punished in the elections.
Yeah, Marco, Richard.
In a way, the breakdown of little parties favors this kind of politics of favors, doesn't it? It fosters corruption to a certain extent, and it's going to be actually interesting. First of all, we've seen here on our local medias the queues for the elections in the last few days. How come there were queues if the turnout wasn't that high? I mean, they make comparison with 2004, where 2004 was a very good turnout because people were energized to go and vote for Mandela. But what's the excuse this time?
Yeah, so this boils down to the Independent Electoral Commission, or IEC, of South Africa that runs the elections. Over the last 3 to 4 years, they've experienced substantial budget cuts. That's not the only excuse. Obviously, that's a bit of a get out of jail free card for them, but that's part of it. So they haven't had the resources to do adequate training. Then you've also had a change in terms of, in the past, if you were registered in a particular voting district, and then subsequently moved elsewhere and didn't change your registration, you could still vote in that new voting district. You just had to fill in another piece of paper. That changed now because of legislation. And then thirdly, this year you had 3 ballots. So you had to vote, you could vote on the national level, provincial, and regional. And that wasn't really, again, the resource point. There wasn't enough, I think, voter education around that, how that works. You could split your vote. You could vote for one party nationally, someone provincially, and then someone regionally. I think that caused a lot of delays and confusion. So the queues, weren't a result of high turnout. They're a result of administrative delays, lack of communication. We had these new sort of digital voter scanning devices to check the voter's roll to see if you were registered in that voting district and you could vote there. Lots of those sort of on these tablets, iPads and Samsung tablets weren't working. But from the IEC sort of management, the national management, they didn't then tell their the administrators at the various voting stations that they could then go to the physical voters roll and use that. So delays around that sort of thing. And usually in South African elections, one would try and go earlier. Usually the voting times are from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. So you go early, get in the queue, then you can enjoy the rest of your sort of public holiday with your family. This time it didn't work out because there were so many people there early, lots of confusion. And then up until the evening. If you're still on the premises of a voting station by 9 p.m., you should have still been allowed to vote. So people were still standing in queues by like 4, 5, 6 a.m. the next morning. So I think there was an element still of that South African resilience and saying, okay, we're in the queue now, we're going to vote. Yes, it's difficult, it's frustrating, but we're going to vote. But issues for the IEC, And again, that gives a reason to parties like Umkhonto we Sizwe and maybe some others to say, oh, why weren't things working? Were you trying to suppress the vote? Were you trying to undermine our support? You know, it chips away a little bit, I think, at citizens' trust, maybe in those sort of institutions of democracy. It's not an overnight thing, but I worry about the longer term trends in that particular, from that particular point of view.
It's certainly a measure of the resilience of South Africans, determined those who did turn out determined to vote and get their inked mark on their finger across the nail to indicate they had voted. One of the things that I think interested me was, well, a couple of things. Firstly, the broad polling did seem to be largely accurate across quite a period of time, certainly ever since Zuma's MK party came into existence. It seems to have been largely reflected, which is quite a feat in a country that must be very difficult to poll ahead of a national election like this. And secondly, I was wondering about the decisions which people take depends on who they are, and the criteria they use for who they vote for depends on who they are, and that can vary enormously from educational level, tribal allegiances, not just to an actual tribe, but maybe to a habit of voting for one particular party, or a family voting for one particular party, or whatever, as opposed to those with a more reasoned-based approach, who perhaps are comparing less the competing competencies of the offerings as opposed to the competing levels of corruption of the offerings, which is always something pretty difficult to ascertain. And certainly when it comes to the lower educational end of the scale, you do read reports, and I don't know whether this is true, and perhaps you can verify, but people are often persuaded to vote by things as low key as having free T-shirts. And that across the board, that must make for a very complicated picture as to what a country really thinks and what it's prepared to make its decisions based on.
I think that's an excellent point on the way to influence maybe voters. The Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula, in the last sort of week before the election, was spotted in a particular township driving through in his G-Wagon, and they were throwing T-shirts at the people sort of running after the car. I mean, talk about a sort of, in one image, a summation of the current ruling party's view of citizen and what they think they deserve. I mean, the social grants at the moment, the social relief of distress grant, this was implemented during COVID. That's 350 Rand a month. I don't know who's very good at conversion, but I don't think it's a lot of pounds or dollars. So it shows you the sort of paltry ways that the party might use to try and influence support. That being said, you might in polling, you might in the sort of streets, in the public, say you're going to vote a particular way or display some sort of indication. But actually, when you're in the secrecy of the ballot box and you feel secure and safe in that, then you actually go and vote differently. And I think we're seeing that especially with MK, where they were polling quite high in the lead up to the elections. But given that they were only started in December of last year, that the party was sort of founded and begun, between 13 and 15% nationally is an incredible achievement, and shows you maybe, number one, the frustrations with the ANC, but also people were sort of waiting for a different alternative to the EFF, for example, who, again, you would think, country with over 30% unemployment, 70% youth unemployment, economic stagnation, the economic freedom fighters just not performing that well. But I think your point around trying to influence voters is well taken. Things like the T-shirts, buying vouchers, or indeed just buying fast food and sort of handing that out and assuming that people will then vote accordingly. Maybe we're seeing some people will still be influenced by that, but for others, there are other considerations on the cards. And it could be a whole range of things. So on the polling, to give, I think, specific mention to the Social Research Foundation, the organization for which I currently work, the Center for Risk Analysis, the director of the Social Research Foundation, Dr. Frans Cornier, he used to work at the Center for Risk Analysis. They've been doing daily polling for the month of May. So they had a sample of 2,000, and every day they took the newest 200 in that particular sample and then polled them and tracked them. So you had a daily tracking poll the whole time. I think for the 28th or the 27th of May, they had the ANC at 42%, which is looking pretty accurate, and all the other parties as well. So it talks to South Africa's quite developed polling industry, or other organizations also. Their polling was particularly good. One of the biggest news stations in the country, ENCA, they did a number of polls, and they're also looking to be proven quite correct. Ipsos, they're generally seen as the most reputable polling entity in South Africa. I think their margin of error might have been out by 2 to 3%, which is, nothing that bad to write home about. Our own polling, because it is quite expensive, we only conducted polling in October of 2023. So that was before MK started. So unfortunately, we can't claim, oh, we called MK at 15% and sort of run off that kind of thing. But it's interesting that you can then measure yourself against other organizations and see how it is relative. So some organizations will do the polling telephonically, some will do in person. A big thing in South Africa to consider for the polling companies is asking questions in a language of the respondents choosing, so that you can ask those questions. As a polling entity, you might want to ask some leading questions, but at least ask the questions in a language that accounts for their nuances that they might use in day-to-day vernacular. And I think that's important in our context.
Chris, earlier on you mentioned perhaps a foreign intervention on the side of Zuma. Somebody calls South Africa a Chinese colony with a Russian accent. What kind of influence do you think is behind, and why? Have you got a sense of what's going on in the background?
There has been a bit more research and write-ups into this particular area, the impact of foreign influence, social media engagement and activity, especially in terms of social media on a platform like X, but also on Facebook, where it seemed like a lot of the accounts and the individuals who used to support and try and vocalize around the EFF then shifted to Zuma in the riots of July 2021, and then in the last 6 months started using hashtags all around MK and sort of vote MK, back MK. But again, to have that sort of reach and influence, you need funding. To me, generally, again, we don't have sort of hard evidence on this, but I see an entity like Russia benefiting more from that sort of uncertainty that this kind of election outcome would result in, because there's more uncertainty. The police, the intelligence agencies aren't as capable of handling all that uncertainty and chaos as they might otherwise be. And then your actors, might then benefit from that sort of environment. So then you could have the backing, obviously, of different horses. Obviously, Russia has stronger ties with the ANC historically and emotionally, ideologically, but you can back a few horses, and regardless of what happens, you still retain some element of influence. South Africa appears to be on some sort of path, for example, towards renewable energy, receiving a lot of funding from the US and European countries, also from the EU itself, for building of wind power, solar power, hydro. Then on the other hand, you have Zuma, who's for years pushed for new nuclear power stations to be built. And when he was president, it was very close to being signed off that we would build new nuclear power stations to be built by the Russians. That, of course, would be very lucrative for those connected to Zuma, but also to Russian companies and the Russian government. So now that Zuma is so strongly back on the forefront, what concessions might he demand in terms of that sort of thing? If he did receive funding, or those close to him receive funding from elsewhere, what concessions would they demand in terms of policy changes or the like? What sort of influence are they looking to extend? I mean, Zuma himself is in his 80s, so maybe the long-term bet is on his children or those closer to him. I think that's a big question that could become quite serious. I mean, for all of its impact in this election cycle, MK, I don't know if there's longevity there, the sort of organizational capacity, that staying power. It's one thing to start a political party, but another thing to actually run it. Just this morning, the founder of the MK party, Jabulani Khumalo, was at the electoral court, asking the electoral court to disqualify Zuma as the leader of MK. So that's sort of that Spider-Man meme where they're all pointing to each other and they're like, I'm the real Spider-Man. No, I'm the real one. So how long does that sort of thing continue and lead to tensions within MK? For all the issues with the ANC, I think there are still bigger things that bind them to each other within the party. MK, because it's so new, it might just be a flash in the pan. That doesn't mean it can't cause sort of damage in the short term. But I wonder about that staying power. And if it doesn't continue to receive funding, if you don't have money for your patronage, for your influence, then, you know, can you really count on the people around you?
And just a quick question on your foreign influence, if I may, just concerning the ICJ case itself, and whether, I mean, you read a lot of internet chatter, and I don't know whether there's any more substantial to it than that, about whether there's Iranian money or influence or kickback towards the ANC for pioneering that case, and of course leading a pro-Hamas charge in the court in The Hague.
There hasn't been more development in that particular vein. It'll be interesting to see now, yeah, not in the next 2 weeks, but especially medium to longer term, how vociferous the ANC, if it does establish some sort of minority government where it's still the biggest, but it runs government, whether it continues that sort of thing, whether it really is concerned from its own moral, ideological point of view, or whether, okay, the money's run out now. We're not sure if you, as the horse that we're backing, can influence things, so we're sort of going to retract from that. And again, because it didn't really translate into votes, then the question is, again, do you continue with it or not? And what are the reasons behind it if you do continue with that sort of the pushing of a particular line or not?
So South Africa is unusual for a country, I guess, that has proportional representation in having this long history of massive majority governments. And when people are talking about this being, you know, the biggest election since 1994, I guess that's true if it really is coming out that the ANC has completely lost that majority, if they're going to get around 40%, like you were saying. So one, I guess it might represent a future for South African politics, which is more like other countries with proportional representation, seeing a much higher prevalence of coalition governments. And so then if the ANC is going to have to reach out to another party, form a deal, make a coalition, I guess ideologically, they're going to be more like the EFF or MK, although presumably they're going to be it's going to be controversial if they make a coalition with MK. Is there any chance? So who do you think they're going to go with? Is there any chance, you know, is it even conceivable that they would reach out to the Democratic Alliance, or who do you think they're going to go with?
I think that is very plausible. And the main reason I say that is sort of ideology and policy aside, both the ANC and the DA broadly buy into the concept, even if the one doesn't really realize that its own policies undermine the concept, but of a central authority or a central government, some sort of monopoly on force, rule of law, independent courts, you know, playing on some sort of level playing field, where MK and the EFF, I think in their manifestos, in their rhetoric, but also in terms of the actions that they've taken, want to undermine that sort of whole edifice and throw that whole thing out. So for the ANC to go into coalition with the DA, it's an entity that you can control a little bit better than you can control MK or the EFF. I think for MK, they would demand, for example, the resignation of Ramaphosa. That would be non-negotiable for them. He has now led the ANC to below 50%, but he's still their best selling point. He's been their best advocate. There isn't really the deputy president, Paul Mashatile, has been building up a base, but there isn't really anyone of the pool of Ramaphosa. I mean, who better than the man of social compacting and compromise than Cyril Ramaphosa to lead a government of national unity, where you say we've invited the DA in, we're responsible centrist Democrats, we want to govern for the good of the country. If you don't come with us, you're irresponsible. You want to make sure that the country sort of falls apart. So for the ANC, I think at the moment they prefer to go with the DA rather than MK EFF. For the DA, yeah, if you're an opposition party, you're the main opposition. If you come into government now and you don't start to substantially reform things and change things, what does that do for you by 2029? You've, throughout the last 2 decades at least, built up and couched yourself as radically different from the ANC. The province that you govern, the Western Cape, generally the best performing province in terms of job creation, attracting investment, more stable than other provinces. It's the most stable of all 9 provinces in terms of attracting new skills, new human capital, new foreign investment, all that kind of thing. If you then go into coalition with the ANC, what does that do for your own credibility and standing as the DA then by 2029? So I think really fraught with risks there for the DA. And within the next 2 weeks, so once the election is completed, you need the National Assembly to then sit within 14 days to between the members elect the new president. So you could still have the ANC as a minority government electing Ramaphosa or someone else as the president of the seventh administration, and then maybe you could have supply and confidence agreements with a party like the DA, where you say we'll vote on budgets together, but policy-wise, running departments, we're not going to give you sort of our sanction. We're not going to approve any of that sort of thing, so that the DA doesn't get couched for if things continue to sort of decline, even if that decline is a little bit delayed. But yeah, I'm definitely ruling out an ANC DA coalition. I think a lot of horse trading happening at the moment. There's videos circulating of the Independent Electoral Commission Action Center in Johannesburg, where you've got these big boards with all the votes being updated sort of every 10 minutes or so, and you'll see a DA politician talking warmly with an ANC politician, and then all the newspaper headlines like, oh, they must be now working together, see, now they've changed and whatever. So people are going to continue to read into these things. I will say that the Rand has firmed up a little bit against the dollar today, and there have been some reports from Bloomberg that the people around Ramaphosa are trying to ensure that the ANC first speaks to the DA, that is their first port of call. For investors and for markets, that's generally been what they've seen as the best outcome. It's the most market friendly in a way. I don't think it is. I mean, it's a short-term sort of band-aid, that kind of thing. It really buys time for the ANC, but your investors and your markets, they want that stability and that predictability. So maybe that's partly why the Rand is looking a little bit better.
Yeah. To be honest, personally, I never thought the possibility of Ramaphosa going for the DA. I naturally assumed you would have gone for MK, trying and fudge something with MK or EFF. But what's the point of view of DA? How would they feel about entering in some kind of agreement with Ramaphosa? I mean, it's very dangerous for them, isn't it? Because they might be seen as, first of all, being seen as sticking a nose in the trough, and second, they might get as you were mentioning earlier on, what's going to do to you in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I think for the DA, I mean, it depends what they measure as success in this election. So if they've now grown from 21% previously, 22, 23, 24%, do they consider that enough of a win? I think they should, especially in the sort of multi-party democracy, representative democracy that South Africa's is. If you campaign on things like, limited free markets, non-racialism, free speech, the rule of law in a country as diverse as South Africa, I think it's credit to you if you're the second biggest political party, and shows you that there is substantive support for your ideas and for your policies. If they consider that enough of a win, then I don't think they'll go into coalition with the ANC. You continue to build, you focus on the provinces, you've maybe grown provinces like the Northern Cape, the Free State. As of the latest numbers, the DA has grown in 6 of the 9 provinces. And again, that's quite substantial. So support across the board, not just in your more traditional areas. On the other hand, if you think getting into national government, getting to appointed ministers and portfolios, maybe Minister of Finance, that's vitally important for the country's sort of fiscal path and fiscal policy and trajectory, maybe government departments, others you try and get that position, then you benefit from that. But I think it would do so much damage to the credibility of the DA amongst its core base that it has done well to win back the last few years, when people became more disillusioned, when they felt the party was now playing the same sort of games as the ANC, talking about affirmative action and wanting to look more transformed, quote unquote, and wanting to be more progressive, all that sort of thing. I think you'll give up a lot over the long term, and that won't put you in a good stead going forward. But I'm not ruling it out. Again, it could come down to pure politics of influence and politics of pull and emotionalism. And yeah, I mean, you get sold the position of deputy president, and what's more enticing than that? You can drive around in your blue light brigades. You don't have to deal with the common riffraff. You can get your generator. You don't have to worry about electricity outages. Yeah, I think more of the DA than that. I don't see them going that route, but I can't, as a sort of someone who tries to do scenario planning and that risk analysis, I can't rule it out. So.
And a lot of the policies across a lot of the parties clearly relate to redistribution of wealth. Even the DA itself has spoken about a basic income grant for example. So it is clearly quite written into the general ideology or general thinking of people. Do you think that plays a part in the ability to join up and find some middle compromise ground, albeit not one that objectivists would necessarily, give 2 thumbs up to?
Yeah, I don't even know. I don't know what percentage of my thumb, what sort of fraction I would give up to that particular arrangement. It would be quite difficult to decide. But yeah, you're exactly right to point that out. I mean, there's acceptance from a moral point of view that you need universal health coverage, that the government needs to provide that in some capacity, your basic income grant or some form of social welfare safety net. You need government to do a whole host of things, given the country's history, to grow the economy, to ensure that there's equity, all that kind of thing. I mean, props up from all the parties in different iterations. I do think the DA has moderated from that point of view in the last couple of years and realized it's a classically liberal party. It needs to focus on certain core tenets and focus on implementing those and make sure that the representatives of the party understand that if they're going to represent it in a substantive way, where in the past, maybe, some people will call it ideological gatekeeping if they're being unkind. But I think if you're going to run on certain principles, you need to ensure that people are trained and educated and understand the sort of principles and values that they stand for. So the pragmatism across the board might make that sort of coalition a bit more possible and more plausible, because you'll say, it's the lesser of two evils and it's a bit more moderate than what could be the case, and you'll try and sell it in that way. But over the long term, I don't think it fixes substantially things from a policy point of view.
And so we mentioned earlier the case brought by South Africa in the ICJ. Just in terms of a broader picture of South African society, how is that playing? So is it working well to secure or to ameliorate dissatisfaction with the various issues we've been talking about, or do people look at it a bit cynically? How are people feeling about it?
Yeah, I don't think it translated in terms of actual voting support. It might have done sort of in the zeitgeist and in the sort of social discussions and given the ANC a bit of a emotional boost for some people. But when their communities, their families, maybe their children, if it's parents, if their job prospects are very poor, I mean, the growth rates, South Africa will be lucky to get between 1 to 2% GDP growth over the next 3 to 5 years. Given that sort of macroeconomic point of view, I think things, in your immediate neighborhood become of more import than what might be happening elsewhere. You might go and take part in a march, you'll post about it on social media, you'll say, look, the ANC, they're what they always used to be, the standard bearer for the global south, whatever that means, all this sort of stuff. It's empty concepts and phrases. But when it comes to voting, you're going to try and vote either for some sort of service delivery issue, something a bit more that'll impact you on a day-to-day basis. Maybe you'll try and support, if in your view you want to support people in Gaza, if you want to help send them aid or something, you'll do that in your own capacity through a charity. But you're not going to think that the ANC is going to affect change in any sort of substantial way.
Marco, Richard?
Well, in terms of foreign policy going forward, do you think there's going to be a significant change? Of course, it depends on the kind of government there's going to be in a few days. But what about, for example, support for Russia and the support for Hamas? Do you think it's significantly changing, or will it be more the same, do you think?
I think likely remaining pretty much the same. If the coalition agreements become very fraught and you've got changes in government all the time, then you won't see anything in a given direction. So you might have from your citizens support in one direction or another, but you won't have the government to carry that out in any particular way, or then a government that wants to impose its view on the citizens South Africa, again, that's not to say that all Christians will vote a certain way, but South Africa tends to be a moderate, more right-leaning, conservative, broad society, cutting across racial lines and income lines. So whether your new government realizes that or not, whether it wants to build on that or play in a different direction, I think is a question and is uncertain at this point in time. I think should it be an ANC minority government, they'll continue to say that they're quote unquote non-aligned, that they don't take sides in any of these particular conflicts. They're just worried about human rights and neutrality. They want everyone to have a voice, all that kind of thing. That doesn't really help, I think, anyone in any substantive way. But yeah, they'll continue to try and maybe play all different sides and put themselves in a good position. I think for businesses and citizens, there, in my view, and we haven't done sort of polling on this, even that would be anecdotal, but there isn't hostility towards, I think, go further, it's an affinity towards the West, to the US, especially those sorts of values for South Africans that those countries and entities sort of represent. So democracy, the rule of law, free speech, multi-party democracy, contestation, responsible government, all that kind of thing. And people want those relationships to continue and to be built on. And I think for South Africa, maybe provinces like the Western Cape, where the DA is in government, some businesses, if they realize those ties, they can continue to build on those, almost regardless of what the national government does. I think so in our briefings to our clients, we try and highlight long-term trends, so don't just get lost in the noise of the day-to-day. But one of the big things is this preoccupation of the political class with itself. So it does these these grand proclamations, and it's going to solve all your problems, but at the end of the day, your citizens just ignore it and they try and do their own thing. And I think that will likely accelerate, especially now that you've got this more fragmented voting base.
Well, one of the words we keep hearing erroneously in the case, obviously, of Gaza is apartheid. And apartheid still seems to be used by the ruling class as an excuse for poor economic performance. We saw a speech from Ramaphosa, shortly before the election, citing that as the main cause for South Africa's underperformance. Whether you consider that underperformance to be somewhere between managed decline and an Atlas Shrugged style, gradual collapse is a moot point. But I wonder whether that holds water in to any extent, and whether simply the generational change, as people move further away from Mandela, from the start from apartheid times, whether that becomes a wafer thin excuse, even those who were perhaps once inclined to give it undue import now.
Even on the campaign trail, and maybe to the embarrassment of some of the ANC leaders, people like former President Thabo Mbeki, under whom the ANC performed the best in terms of building and implementing policies that encourage the private sector to invest and economic growth, boosting economic growth, etc. When he's been on the campaign trail the last month, you'll have elderly South Africans in poorer areas who say, but things were better under apartheid. Things worked better, etc., etc. Obviously, from a moral point of view, I don't think there can be any comparison between the two. But in terms of your basic governance, etc., a lot of people, for the older generations, they feel things at least worked a bit better. So I think it's a bit of both. You'll see, as people who grew up with the ANC, who supported it always for their whole lives, as they become older and then die, you'll see that support declining and that excuse not being effective. But even as the population generally becomes more urbanized, more educated, that excuse doesn't fly. And even some of the core policies, things around affirmative action, for example, what is in South Africa Black economic empowerment, the consequences thereof are being even discussed at this point in time, where, like, the organization for which I work, even raising the doubt around it 5 years ago, maybe even 2 to 3 years ago, would have been the sort of taboo subject. Now in your corporate boardrooms, etc., the discussion is, it has worked, but it's only benefited your sort of top 5% with the necessary political connections, as with the necessary influence and clout. It's not working for the majority of citizens. It's not unlocking economic growth in any substantive way. So even core policies around the narrative of, look what apartheid did to you, look what we're doing, we're implementing these positive policies, because their consequences are always going to be negative. I think people are starting to ask the question, is this really the right path going forward? Whether other parties have done enough to convince voters to shift to them yet or not is arguably still up for debate. And as voter turnout declines, it becomes all the more uncertain, and people might turn in more populist directions. But I think there is generally the sort of, I mentioned when Ramaphosa came into power, the new dawn and the Ramaphoria. I think, yeah, the perception around that has very much fallen by the wayside now.
So we have two super chats. We have $5 from Ginger and $4 from Jonathan. Thank you very much, guys. We're just going to have to wrap up since we're in the last few minutes, but thank you so much for joining us, Chris. That was really great. There's definitely a really interesting new future for coming for South Africa electorally, with that kind of dominance of the ANC breaking up just a little bit. So this is something to watch in the coming years. Just a couple of announcements for the channel at the top of the hour. So just in 2 minutes on the Briefly Objective, we have a video going live featuring Peter Schwartz called "The Palestinian People Have No Right to a State." So everyone should go over there and catch that. Also, just on the Reality Digest, our new news commentary newsletter, we released the first issue of that to everyone on our Ayn Rand Centre UK newsletter for free. We had such a good response to that. We're actually going to do the second one for free as well. So that's going to come out this Sunday or this Monday. The issues we've been speaking about today, the Donald Trump trial and South Africa, are both going to feature in that. So you guys can head over there to see a bit more developed commentary on that. And then after Sunday or Monday, it's going to go just to the gold members. So if you guys sign up, you can see it, get a flavor of it, and then you can go sign up to be a gold member and support the kind of work we do here. But thank you so much, guys. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective. We'll see you all then. Bye-bye.
Thank you.